Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Mind of Her Own. I have some returning guests today. I'm so excited. So, Anu Gorakanti and Laura Holford are an MD RN team who co founded the collective Introspective Spaces with a mission to create contemplative community spaces for healthcare workers to reconnect with themselves and each other, and to reimagine a new way forward in healthcare. So I participated in one of their Artist's Way cohorts recently and found it incredibly helpful as I struggled with my own role as a physician in today's difficult healthcare environment. So, Anu and Laura, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Jenna. We're so happy to be here and so excited to come back and get to talk about all the amazing things that you're doing too.
Oh, that's very kind. You guys are just the most amazing and supportive team. And you're approaching 5 years of introspective spaces. I know in our first interview, we talked about the beginnings of that and why you decided to create it. But maybe you guys could share a bit about that again, and then we'll jump into what it's been like over these past 5 years in this role.
You go ahead, Anu.
Yeah, I know. It feels like a long time ago, I think, since we had our last interview. And it's definitely been a lot of learning and growing and kind of figuring out all the different ways that we can serve healthcare workers. And so I think in the last few years, it's been really beautiful to kind of come back to the power of creativity, to community building, to interdisciplinary friendship, and kind of use those as like the anchors and pillars of the work that we do now. And so it's been such a blessing to get to do our Dissuade program, which kind of helps healthcare workers reconnect with their creativity. We've hosted spaces for grief. We've held retreats. We've starting a book club. I feel like we found and are continuing to find different ways for people to be in community with each other. And I think for both Laura and I, that was kind of the foundation for why we started Introspective Spaces, is that we both felt really isolated and alone in our healthcare roles and feeling like we were the only ones who felt the way that we did, who were struggling with moral distress and feeling like we were the only ones impacted. And sharing that story with each other helped us kind of lift up that veil and realize that we're not alone. And I think that's kind of our mission and why we do the work that we do.
The only thing I will add is it's 5 years now and it's felt so slow. But we've accepted that's the natural pace of our work, and it's just been really beautiful to accept that slowness in building an organization and building like a hybrid nonprofit social enterprise that goes directly opposite to the pace of our healthcare roles and our healthcare lives. So I think that's where we're at right now. 5 years in is just slowly meeting our people one at a time and building these small communities of care across the country. I think we're in about 5 or 6 cities now where we're hoping to build these long-term kind of communities where healthcare workers can be in real relationship and risk vulnerability and um, find moral community to resist this system that's centered in profit, while also, showing up as a human.
Mhm. And I think Laura reminds me of like kind of one of our OGs, Adrienne May Brown, and her work Emergent Strategy, which is like our foundational text. And in her book, she has this quote by Stephen Covey that says, "Change moves at the speed of trust." And I think as you're talking, it reminds me like that has been our core principle, that we know that it's slow work, but it can only move as we build trust with ourselves, each other, and that a true relationship building takes a long time.
Mm-hmm. I started watching The Pit. I don't know if either of you have watched that on
I
HBO.
haven't
No.
heard much about it.
Yeah. I started it previously and it felt a little too intense and too close to training, and I had to step away for a bit, and then I kind of came back to it. And one of the things that really struck me is that they show these scenes where the whole group in the emergency room, physicians and nurses and other techs, come in and take a moment after they've lost a patient, or
Mhm.
they reflect on it. And it made me think of the two of you, because I thought this if it really were occurring regularly and frequently and across different spaces in healthcare, would be a small but important step in the right direction. And I'm wondering how, when you talk about this as a slow process, what are the little changes that you're maybe starting to see in the people that you're speaking with, and how they're approaching the healthcare environment? What are they maybe trying to bring
Mhm.
into the environment, such as those kinds of moments?
I think so. The artist's way, these communities of care, I see it as like a training ground to start practicing these small acts of reclaiming your own value.
Mm-hmm.
Remembering that there is an inner child inside of you, and that person also deserves time and space to know, to like be known and to know oneself. And so how we hope this comes out when folks return to work is that they realize that they can show parts of themselves again, that they can pause and take more time with their patients. And in an ideal world, we're building these relationships in these vulnerable pods that we're starting to see colleagues join together and they can return to work as a physician and a nurse with a totally different relationship where these silos and these barriers existed before have fallen away, and we can see each other as just humans who are both suffering under the same um, constraints of profit over people. And as I think we've talked about before, we came to this question of what if humanizing healthcare starts with humanizing one another. And so we started this pie in the sky of we want the whole system to change, but we realized, wow, like even just how we relate to each other has so much power in shifting the culture of healthcare and how we relate to our patients.
Yeah, and I love that example you brought from the pit. That's actually the specific story that a lot of people have shared with me. I think because in a sense, in a sad way, it's aspirational. Like that what seems so simple and maybe even intuitive on a TV show is not what happens actually in healthcare, and like and how little time that takes to pause and honor someone who has died, and how much I hope we can get to that moment. And I think one of the things that Laura and I like to focus on in our work is helping people reclaim their agency in spaces outside of healthcare first, because we sometimes when we go to work we feel really helpless and we feel like we're a part of this system that's so much bigger than ourselves that it can feel almost impossible to change. And so I think when we come to spaces and we realize like, oh, our being able to bear witness to a colleague is very powerful and very meaningful, and that just that alone is healing. I think it helps us remember like what brought us into our healthcare roles, that like our presence is actually so powerful. And then I think when people go back, we've heard from folks like sometimes it's helped them build a more healthy relationship with their clinical role. I think folks who felt like they lost their sense of self, or who poured every ounce of who they were to the point that it was detrimental, were able to recognize that. And I think one of our friends who has done this program a couple of times felt like it helped her come back to life. Like she felt like she had lost so much of herself in her training. And I think for many people, after going through the training that we go through, it's one of the first times where they're asking themselves, like, can I do this in a sustainable way? Is my identity fully wrapped up in my healthcare role to the point that, like, whatever happens there impacts me to a level that's hard for me to cope with? And I think I had another friend, another colleague who went through this program, who I think was learning to say no to things that were overextending her ability to be present and to offer the kind of care that she wanted. And it's like, oh, I don't need to do all these extra things just because people ask me. Like, what I'm doing is enough. And so I think we have been seeing people in these small ways, like find their own sense of agency again. And I think even for myself as a practicing clinician, like I never imagined I would make it 5 years out of residency. This past July was like my fifth year practicing still. And I think my own friendship and relationship with people who are in different healthcare roles fundamentally changes how I engage in my work in the hospital, and how it helps me build sustainability by being genuine friends with everyone on my team, and how it feels a bit countercultural, I think, even when I'm there, but how much it adds to the richness and meaning that you have, especially where I work in a county hospital. there's so much we cannot control, and there's so much suffering and sorrow that we see, that at least knowing that I have genuine relationships with the people I work with, sometimes that's like the only thing that I have when there's so much else that I can't do.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I know in participating in Artist's Way, which I was doing during a time where I was really trying to sort out my ideas around being a physician, what that could look like, and what that was supposed to look like. I think there's a socialization of any healthcare provider about this is what a good,
Mm-hmm.
nurse, physician, what have you is, what it looks like, and any deviation from that is risking your identity or risking this sense of all this work you put in to your
Mm-hmm.
role. And one of the things I really enjoyed about the Artist's Way was in trying to reconnect with our imagination, with our creativity. I was doing all of these wonderful, silly projects. You guys were the best cheerleaders, Laura in particular, because she was in my group, and I would crochet things or like paint by numbers. This like terrible looking tiger that I still have in my bedroom. But this idea of allowing people in this very serious, as you said, kind of sorrow filled at times business to do things that are playful and
Mm-hmm.
joyful and fun. And I wonder if you could share some of those experiences in working with largely women, but other people in healthcare in these areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're expected to wear such armor in healthcare. Like that is the accepted way to show up at work, and is to show up as unfazed when really terrible things happen in front of you. And that's like that's the capital or something at work, is to be the most somber or the most just stoic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, that didn't affect me moving on. And I mean, it's protective and you have to be that way because after a patient passes, you have to just go to your next patient. And because of the way things are set up. And so I think this invitation to serious play, um, helps to bring in vulnerability and to let your inner child come out. And your inner child, when they see somebody die, has a big reaction, finds that very upsetting. So I think when we access our playful side, we also open ourselves up to the other emotions that we um, tamp down at work. Um, and I have heard from folks in our community that they've allowed themselves for the first time to cry with a patient instead of just apologizing that they're experiencing something, to actually enter into that moment with them. And the patient said, "Thank you for being human." And so, yeah, like we lose this our sense of agency, our ability to feel like we're helping or healing, but kind of this backdoor way back into it is through allowing ourselves this silliness, this play, which then allows us to also feel in pain and suffering again too.
Yeah, I think it's been really fun to see how different people engage with creativity. And for some people, it's like very art based. Like they start with watercolor and they do all these things. And some people are like baking again or roller skating or are doing like I think the way that people interpret creativity in itself, I think is the first step in permission. Because I think for many people who we work with who are healthcare workers and we're so accustomed to like there being one right answer, having to grapple with there is no right way to be creative. It's not even necessarily about art. And I think that's like the wrestling with that first step, I think, and the perfectionism that comes around that, I think is one of the most challenging, but for folks who are able to be with it, like rewarding parts of it. And I think for myself, the first time, this will be our fourth time, I think, going into it. The first time I couldn't even think of an artist date or creative thing to do for like 6 weeks because I was like, I have no clue. Like, what should I do? And I had like a former life as a photographer before our son was born. And I was like, I don't know if I want to return to that. And the first thing I did was I just started taking baths. That was just like the simple thing of like, this is purely fun. This has no agenda. You cannot be good or bad at it. You just sit here and that's it. And I think that opened up this portal of like how many years it had been since I had allowed myself to do something that had no purpose, that I couldn't try to improve myself on, or that wasn't like oriented in productivity. And I think since that moment, it's been for myself really fun to experiment. Now I'm doing pottery, which is really fun, and it's like very humbling. I think it's a good one for physicians because I think, and there's always a physician in my pottery class, because I think it's very perfectionism confronting because you can't be good, especially at the wheel for wheel throwing. Like you're just gonna be bad for 6 months, and it's hard, but it's liberating in a sense to realize like our jobs are serious, and we know that we don't want to make mistakes because it's people's lives, and we recognize where that comes from. But the shadow side is the perfectionism that comes out at work and that carries into the rest of our life. And I think when we engage in creative practice, we're able to understand how we got to that point and have healthier ways of recognizing that we are human, even at work, that mistakes do happen as much as we try to prevent them. And in the rest of our life, we can be silly, we can have joy, we can be playful, like we don't have to be perfect. And I think that can be really liberating after many, many years of not really being allowed to do that.
Absolutely. And I know, Laura, you've talked about this idea of the slow productivity movement and this kind of mindset of, because I do think productivity comes up so much. I mean, we're obviously pushed to produce, and they did feature that. I thought, well, on the pit, it was like we need to get higher patient satisfaction scores, and they said, well, we're waiting 6 hours in the waiting room, so by the time they come to us, those scores are already terrible. Well, see what you can do to try and change that. So we are pushed, I think, to think of things on the 20 minutes, on the half hour, on the hour. How many can we see during a shift? And I'm wondering how you bring in that idea of slow productivity, maybe share a bit about what that means for listeners, and then how you could, or we could, incorporate that into this profit-driven, fast-paced field.
Right. I think the short answer is I don't know if we can, but then I have a hopeful answer too. Um, I was reading Cal Newport's Slow Productivity, and I really appreciate that he called out this is near impossible in healthcare as it's currently structured. Um, he defines slow productivity as doing fewer things, working at a natural pace, like things take the time that they take. Mind blowing for us to hear. And to obsess over quality. Those all feel very extremely out of reach for me as a nurse. So he does offer for those of us who are in healthcare, he's like, you may not be able to do that at work right now, the way it's set up, but where can you do it in your life? Where can this revolution start? Where can this corner of slowness start? And I think that's without knowing it, that's what we've been trying to do with Introspective Spaces is where Anu and I are like strong idealists. So we're building these small communities built on those values that maybe one day, if a bunch of healthcare workers in small pods across the country are creating these slower ways of being, valuing our own time and allowing ourselves to take baths, allowing ourselves to obsess over quality and work at a natural pace in other areas of our lives, like maybe we can bring that back as we're like self-organizing into these groups. So I don't think it's possible quite yet, but I thought something that was interesting for us in our group, Jenna, was we found through our Artist Way group that all of us in our pod had decided to work part-time. And we found that out about halfway through. We're like, oh, whoa, we all work part-time. And I know that's not feasible for everybody, but it opened this conversation of how can we design the rest of our lives to prioritize our own well-being. And I think it's an act of resistance to say, yeah, I'm going to consume less. I'm not going to, my child's not going to be in every sport or whatever sacrifice that we made to make that decision. Again, not possible for everybody, but really bringing your values to how you design your life and realizing what's sustainable for you. And a value that I've chosen to center in my life is simplicity. Sometimes I get far away from that, but when I do feel the friction of, oh, I wish I could do that, or I wish I could have that, realizing, oh, I have a little bit more time, and I made that decision intentionally, so that Anu and I could have this time to build this kind of social enterprise together that is practicing these ideas of healthcare workers deserve rest, healthcare workers deserve care. healthcare workers deserve to be well.
Mhm.
Just kind of, we're attempting to practice that together.
Mhm.
It makes me really think. I mean, going through the artist's way and experiencing that and just connecting with you too over the years, your work of Parker Palmer, who I had on the podcast, which was
I
such
know.
a
Ugh.
delight, and talking about the idea of vocation and that you really can learn from as much from the kind of barriers you hit or the things that don't work for you or that you can't sustain as you can from those you can. And I've taken, as I've sort of been finishing out my book, which comes out this month finally, I took like a clinical sabbatical and really stepped away from clinical practice for a bit. And, talk about guilt. Like my book's guilt free, it's all about guilt. And I really had to rely on the things I had written as I was stepping away because, again, that identity of what a healthcare provider, what a physician does is you care for patients one on one directly. That's just it. And if without that, there was really a ton of guilt. But it was so difficult to work in that environment where most of my time was spent referring people out because I couldn't see them all in my practice and thinking who deserves to get some care for this time period that I have available versus who doesn't, because everyone does. And I think just the complexity of that and the guilt around that, but also the grief of how did I end up in a field that has these kinds of challenges and has a setup where people are not reimbursed for mental health treatment, so everyone's out in private practice trying to do self-pay and feeling conflicted about that. Like it just was,
Mhm.
it really gave me time to reflect and step back. And I do think there actually is a lot of grief in having to let go of the idea of what I would look like as a physician or what time I would put in or what environment I would work in and trying to find my own path forward from here. And I'm wondering what you've experienced in thinking about like healthcare related grief and that area.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I think that's such a good question. And actually, it really comes from Parker Palmer, so much of our work. But in medical school, I think I had recommended that book, Let Your Life Speak. It was maybe is what we had first spoke about. But I read that book when I was in residency, and I had received it in medical school when I had hosted an interfaith retreat with one of our mentors. Did not read it at that time. But in residency, I was really struggling to find my place and feeling like I'm not sure I can practice medicine in the way that I'm seeing it play out. It feels really in conflict with my values. And when I read Let Your Life Speak at that time, I think for me, the question that really came out was Parker Palmer, who is an amazing Quaker theologian, kind of wrestling with the question of who he was not, more so than who he was. And then when I graduated in the pandemic, and kind of the first 2 years we were starting Introspective Spaces, I had to really sit with that question. And I wonder if it's a lot of a question that many healthcare workers navigate. I use it a lot with trainees now who are still trying to figure out what they want to do. Is I encourage them to really be honest about maybe the story that brought them into medicine, like the imagery, the vocational quest. I think that they thought, and for me, there's a lot of grief in realizing that I could not become the doctor I thought I was going to be. Like I had this image of working at the border, of being so present in community in that really specific way. But then finding when I was actually doing that, like mentally, I was having nightmares, I wasn't sleeping, I was having a really difficult time physically and emotionally, and having to really reconcile with like, oh, I'm not the language I used at the time, which was not maybe very kind to myself, but I was like, I'm not cut out to do this. And I think I had to spend a couple of years like with shame and guilt and sorrow and grief, and in order for me to accept who I actually am. And I think one of the things that's interesting about healthcare is that we spend so much time witnessing suffering, like death, illness, injustice. And I think we don't talk about the toll that that takes to be that witness over time. And I think part of the grief that you're mentioning, Janice, too, is like when we come in with a specific story, that story does not include how complicated healthcare actually is in practice. That the system that we are in is not designed for us to be the doctors, nurses, healthcare workers that maybe our vocational quest had wanted us to become. And so it's like, for me, I think about even going to work right now, I accept that there is always going to be grief there. Like there will never be a shift that I don't feel a sense of grief. And the grief is not just the patients who I've cared for who've died, but also the grief at injustice, the grief at witnessing harm in the healthcare system, a grief of being a pediatrician and realizing that I can't prevent harm from happening to children. The best I can do is reduce the amount of harm that will happen. And I wish that in our culture, we created more space to acknowledge grief and that we weren't so afraid to recognize that these things that we experience have real human impact on us. And over time, many of us who are early in our career have seen it played out with people who've been here a long time. There's a few people we maybe see who still are in touch with that tender part of their heart, but many people, to survive, your armor is so great that when something really painful or harmful happens, you have no reaction. And so I think grief is one of the missing pieces in healthcare culture of an acknowledgement, a space for processing, a space for grappling with our identity. And I think that we can't really imagine a new way and forward in healthcare unless we make space to grieve.
What do you imagine that, what shape could that take? Is that something that you've been able to, or you've thought about with introspective spaces, how to support that kind of environment? And how can we help each other even within the healthcare space?
Yeah, it's one of the areas that I've thought a lot about since grief is what brought me to this work with introspective spaces, like being in residency and not having space to grieve the patient, the children who died, and continuing to round and feeling like, how am I the only one so heartbroken every day? And in our work, realizing like, oh, okay, like I'm not the only person. Like maybe we're all just have this armor, and I didn't know who else was impacted. And I think for Laura and myself, it's like for us leading with vulnerability and sharing our grief. And we've been hosting grief spaces that are just like drop in spaces. We started in December 2023 with grief spaces for Gaza, and then have probably held five or six over the last 2 years for health justice, for the people impacted by the LA fires, for people impacted by ICE. And I think that has been a small way, I think, for us to have a space for people to at least know that other people feel grief, even if they cannot come, even if they're not ready, just to know that you can have a space where grief is welcome and that it's maybe a normal human reaction. And I think my dream is for every healthcare worker to have a space to grieve, that they know that there's a place where no matter what their worldview is or their cultural tradition, that there are spaces where they can access ritual and community whenever they need it. And that grief is not just death, that you can have grief about injustice, you can have grief about transition. Like so many things, even in our life that are joyful, can also have twinges of grief. And so I think that's our hope in this year. And part of my return to that work has been tending to my own grief. And I think for the first time, carving out time to really commemorate all the patients I've cared for who died, who I've never had a chance to mourn.
And I think like when Anu and I started this work, we were both in like such moral distress, like so much rage and anger and grief, that all we had was just like criticism. And I think introspective spaces is like our response to that of like, how can
Mhm.
not just criticize something, but like make an alternative to that.
Mhm.
Um, like the Richard Rohr quote, the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. And so, introspective spaces is centered in using ritual and art, return
Mhm.
to ancient ways that human beings have come together to process difficult things. Nothing that we're doing is new. We're just trying to create an alternative place where healthcare workers can come return to those practices.
Mhm.
And so I think that's, Anu's Buddhist tradition, my Christian tradition, using these different ancient rituals to that have been stripped from our healthcare environments to expose our own spirituality. To even speak the word spirituality feels pretty wild as a healthcare worker. So, just realizing that there are many parts of ourselves that we bring to our patients and to work. And we hope that we're creating spaces where we can, bring all parts of ourselves.
And I've been blessed. I think as we've done this work, we've met so many beautiful people in so many different sectors that do aligned work and have been amazing supports. And so my friend Mengda is a death doula who's Buddhist. And so she and I are working together now as I'm like learning what a death doula does and also finding space for the first time to like honor my own healthcare grief. And so I think it's one of the things that Laura and I, as we go deeper into our own capacity building, like want to share and talk about that there's so many people and resources that exist that may feel very countercultural and very non-traditional, but I think are ways that we can kind of grow our communities. And I think it's been really beautiful since I do a lot of work in an interfaith space. And so I'm taken out of healthcare quite a lot. And I work with people in many faith traditions and many different kinds of jobs that in sharing our story of what healthcare workers are going through, I think it parallels many other groups, immigration lawyers, clergy, chaplains, like so many other people are navigating similar moral distress sectors. But I think it's so rare for us to get to be in community where we get to share those stories with each other and listen. And so I feel a lot of gratitude. I think one of the blessings of our last 5 years is that we've been able to meet and grow our community of support for healthcare workers, for people to know that there's so many ways they can be in community and have access to care.
And can we ask you a question?
Sure.
So I cannot wait to see what's in your book, all the secrets. But I also feel like I'm speaking with the author, so I could probably just you. I guess I wonder if some of this came up in your research, like these things that help us stay whole and like show up to work as women with many responsibilities and like, some of the things that we've identified, like carving out time for yourself, carving out time for ritual or your spirituality, or like has any of that come up in your research in terms of navigating grief or sorry, guilt?
And I think the thing I'll add to that too is like one thing we haven't brought in is that Laura and I, we're all parents. And I think that adds like a huge dimension to being a healthcare worker parent that I think is probably an identity we don't get to talk about much at work, but takes up so much of our mental and emotional space.
Yeah, I think there are certainly parallels that I've seen in my practice and in my research between the socialization that we as women face from a very young age and how we're expected to be kind of consistent caretakers, available at all times to care for everyone, hyper accountable, especially for other people's emotions, that I'm responsible for how you are feeling, which of course is almost impossible. And then trying to strive for perfection, whether it's in self-control, in our bodies, in our moods, in how we're demonstrating our moods, even during different cycles throughout the month. And I think the last one being this idea of having it all, this balance. And so really looking at the socialization of these expectations for women, but also for healthcare workers, there are a lot of parallels. So women in healthcare, it's like, and others and women in healthcare, it's just this like, you're hit from all sides. And in kind of thinking about how to start reflecting on it, I think for me, gaining insight into where the guilt's coming from was such a big and important part that I used a lot of the book for that. And the second half is more the step-by-step process. But the simplification of that down to what I call the guilt equation, because I like math, is that our guilt really is the difference between our expectations for ourselves, which aren't just ones that we've come up with. Like I said, we're socialized to carry these expectations and then expected to and reminded to and again and again. The difference between that and what we see ourselves as doing. What's our perceived reality here? So, for example, in a healthcare setting, if I had a patient who was really struggling and my expectation was, I'm not a good doctor unless I can fix every patient, everything for them and make them feel exactly like they want to feel. and I'm not there, my expectation is here, and I feel like I'm not measuring up. That disparity is where guilt thrives, where guilt exists. And so a lot of the strategies I talk about in the book, one is to really sort of interrogate those expectations. Where
Mm.
did they come from? And that's been really important for me as a mother, certainly, like a good mother would, all these different things, right? A good mother, even when she was sick, would get up and take care of her kids. Like, yes, to a degree, but not to her own detriment. Or that, a physician, a good physician would see this many patients every day, every week, blah, blah, blah. And I think interrogating those expectations, figuring out where they're coming from, and are they coming from sources that we want to continue to buy into and believe
Mm.
in and support? Because in a lot of cases, it may not be. It's either how we were raised, what we encountered. I mean, the medical students on the pit, as I watch them go through this series of like, really, this is how it is, and like
Mhm.
I have to be like this, and okay, and then you just see them like hardening as they go through. And you think about, okay, those expectations were built by those people in my orbit during my
Mhm.
training, and do I want to continue to let them decide for me how I
Mhm.
define the work that I do or the person that I am? And then on the flip side of that equation is just, how do I focus more attention on the things I'm actually doing? What am I doing
Mhm.
well? How am I contributing? Right? When you guys sit back and think about introspective spaces and you're almost 5 years in, and all of the people that you have connected with and supported and helped, me definitely included in that, reminding yourself, focusing attention on the ways that we are showing up and the things we are doing well, because I think we tend to kind of dismiss that and just focus on the
Mhm.
problem or focus on what we're not achieving yet. And I think those two variables, it gives us a chance to really like apply that to any moment of guilt in our lives and kind of look at what's creating it and how could we start to shift that guilt.
I love
Yeah,
that.
I love that. And I think this like that framing of like whose expectations are we holding? And like even pausing to think about like whose voice comes up when I hear like a mother does this or a
Mhm.
physician does this, and like having to be like, wait, is that my voice or is that someone else's voice? Like
Yeah.
sometimes we don't even know.
It kind of brings me back, Jenna, to we were talking about your silly crafts earlier, and
Mhm.
you made like little crochet pumpkins and little craft kits. And I think I remember you telling us one time that you just sat at your kitchen with your family all around and you're just working on your little craft. And they're like, excuse me, you know, aren't you supposed to be, and
Mm-hmm.
so that little act of resisting, others' expectations, resisting the script that is set for women or mothers. Yeah, it just seems like a small, silly thing to like take time out to make a craft, but like I think underneath it, it's quite radical. And
Mhm.
I think that's like what we're trying to do together is, believe that we deserve a different story. And I think there's 1,000 ways to get to that new story. And I commend whatever path it is to find that belief that we do deserve, this goodness. And yeah, I think creativity is one of those paths that can help us realize that there's different expectations that we can um, have for ourselves and change that side of the equation at least.
Right.
Yeah, and for me, it felt very radical to take sort of a clinical sabbatical and step away and say, let me just catch my breath here and really identify and examine those expectations about what kind of
Mhm.
physician I was supposed to be. Because I did, of course, imagine my father in a small town practice where he had a ton of
Mhm.
admin support, no pressure on time, took time with patients, everything was sort of done at his own pace. It was just a different era, and
Mhm.
I don't live in that era, and I have to let go of that idea but create for myself the values that are inherent in that, which is, how do I have enough time to connect with patients? How do I have enough a directive approach that I can be ethical in the distribution of time and energy I give to people, so I don't feel
Mhm.
like I'm just constantly sending people away and focusing on a very small number? So how do I have to build my practice? And it's something I've been thinking about a lot because I do miss the patient care, which came as a relief because for a while I was like, okay, maybe this is just I'm shifting away and now I'm going to write, what have you. But I do miss that. And so, how can I create that with expectations that I choose and in a way that I feel aligns with my values? And that feels kind of radical because it doesn't, I can't go find it out there. I have to create
Mhm.
it and then live it. And then you guys are two such mentors in doing that, because this is what you're doing all the time, I think, with Introspective Spaces.
Yeah, I'm excited for you on that journey. I think it is definitely not for the faint of heart. I think as you kind of walk the path that you are forging, but I think it's really beautiful to recognize like, oh, I can build this. I can think about what brings me joy and meaning, what patients deserve, and I can think about how to craft that, and it will be radically different and it'll change over time. But I think just knowing that we have that power, and I think for me right now, I've been feeling really called to learn about community organizing and really thinking about how do we healthcare workers remember that we have this agency, that the healthcare system will not function if we're not there.
Yeah.
And I think our training really dehumanizes us and makes us feel like, oh, we're lucky to be here. Like we don't deserve to ask for anything because if we weren't here, someone else would be here.
Right.
And I think it's like it takes a long time, I think, to let go of that narrative, to let go of the narrative that anyone who agitates the system is harmful, lazy, like whatever adjective comes up for someone who decided to go against the grain early on in our training, and then thinking about like how do we come back and make something that doesn't exist yet
Mm-hmm.
but has the potential to live out the values that I think healthcare should have this whole time.
Yeah, Adrienne Marie Brown kind of calls that like an imagination battle, like
Hmm.
living in somebody else's imagination right now. The way healthcare is was not by accident, but designed on purpose by a few people in a boardroom. Um, but how can we activate our imagination? And I think your version of a psychiatrist practice sounds beautiful.
Yeah.
Now it's in your head and you're going to create that in real life. But like the first step is imagining it. And when we're in moral distress, when we're in anger, when we're in guilt, we cannot access that
Mhm.
creativity or that imagination to create that future. So, um, yeah.
And I wanted to say too, I love like the work that your that Guilt Free does, like kind of helping like mothers and parents like also grapple with that additional layer. We for this last cohort for the first time we had an artist way group specific for healthcare parents,
Mm.
and it was really beautiful because I think it was for the first time many people got to bring in that part of their identity, which is a huge part for many of us of even like why we do this work, like where our justice work comes from, where our emotional capacity goes. And we had different folks kind of across the country in different specialties kind of talking about like the logistical navigation and the harm of just like structurally that people didn't understand or protect their time or value like their experience of parenthood, but also just coming back into a clinical space as a parent and now finding that it all takes a different emotional toll. And it's like grappling with the fact that you feel like you can't be fully present in either space, that you have like your clinical practice and then you come home and there's always something that's being sacrificed a little bit. And I think learning to reframe that and like find beauty in that, I think is really challenging. And I hear from a lot of my colleagues how much guilt people feel about wanting to maintain both those parts of their identity.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really beautiful at our last in-person celebration in Los Angeles, celebrating the graduates of our last Artist Way cohort. We had both invited healthcare workers to share their art, which was mind-blowing for one. But two, someone brought her children and to have children with us and to, that just shifted the dynamic in the most beautiful way of like, look at us, here we are as healthcare workers, as artists, and as parents, all in the same space, to be able to bring all those parts of ourselves and be seen fully was it was really special.
I love that. One day I'm going to get to one of those in person events. It is on my absolute list. So, Laura and Anu, thank you so much for the work that you're doing, for coming on and speaking to me about it, for your help in my personal journey, which has been absolutely enormous. I think you were one of the first people to ever contact me about something I had written and say, "Hey, I liked what you wrote." And I was like, "What? Is this how it works? Like, this is magic." So thank you both so much for joining me, and I can't wait to see what you do next.
Likewise.
And we're so excited. When is the official release date for the book?
January 27th.
Oh my gosh,
So,
in a few
yes,
weeks.
it's always
We
on
can't
Tuesdays
wait.
for some reason. So, yep, people can pre-order it. I always put a link in the podcast notes, and I'll put your information so people can find out more about Introspective Spaces and hopefully connect.
We're so grateful to have you part of the community, and we're so excited for your book to come out.
Thank you.